Klobuchar calling it quits today, dropping out of the presidential race and saying she'll endorse former Vice President Joe Biden. NBC News political reporter Ali Vitali is with me now from Boston. And Ali, tell us the latest from the Klobuchar camp.
Yeah, the Klobuchar campaign announcing today that they are dropping out of the race and going to Dallas tonight to endorse former Vice President Joe Biden. And really what we're seeing here is this big sea change from South Carolina to now. We knew that the 72 hours between South Carolina and Super Tuesday were going to be crucial for all of these campaigns. But really what we're seeing is a sea change in favor of Joe Biden. Let me just chart the path for you from the way this year began to where we are right now, though, Allison. We saw Joe Biden have less than inspiring debate stage performances. That pushed even people like Michael Bloomberg to think maybe this guy isn't as strong as we think he was, even pushing Bloomberg to get in the presidential race, reversing a decision that he had made earlier in 2019. Now we see Joe Biden, and then we saw Joe Biden in Iowa, New Hampshire, even Nevada, having middling finishes. A lot of people wondering if there really was a lane to take on Joe Biden as the moderate alternative in the minds of voters. That's where people like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar were really able to get a look from people across the country as maybe moderate alternatives to Joe Biden. Then South Carolina comes along, a state that Joe Biden had long called his firewall, and obviously they were able to win there. And I feel like you and I were talking about this, the difference for Joe Biden between just winning South Carolina and winning South Carolina big. This is the difference. He won big there, probably bigger than a lot of people expected he would. And now this is the impact of that. Seeing Pete Buttigieg drop out and knowing that there wasn't a path for him. Seeing Amy Klobuchar drop out, seeing that there wasn't a path for her. And for Klobuchar, it's important to note that Super Tuesday was, yes, an important day for all the delegates that were on the table, but she also had a home state that was voting that day. Minnesota is a Super Tuesday state. When I talked to her just a few days ago and asked her how she thought she was going to do there, she was pretty bullish that she was going to win. And yes, the polls showed her ahead, but at the same time, it did also show Bernie Sanders on her heels there. She's not the only senator who's still running who has Bernie Sanders on her heels in the home state. Elizabeth Warren, where I'm standing in Massachusetts, she's got some competition from Bernie Sanders here as well. But as far as it looks for Amy Klobuchar, they made the decision that it was not worth competing on Super Tuesday, instead throwing their goodwill behind someone like Joe Biden. Though I will note, endorsements are important, but not all endorsements are created equally. And here's what I mean by that. You see the power of an endorsement by someone like Jim Clyburn in South Carolina. 50% of voters there saying that they made their decision based on what Clyburn said. What I'm interested in seeing is once you take that national and you say that Amy Klobuchar is endorsing Joe Biden, what does that actually do? Because out here on the campaign trail, voters don't vote by lane logic. Just because they supported Amy Klobuchar as their first choice does not necessarily mean that their second choice is Joe Biden or another moderate candidate. In fact, when Pete Buttigieg dropped out, the polling that started percolating online was all of the polling that showed that people who supported Pete Buttigieg first even had Bernie Sanders as their second choice. And it just goes to show you that voters don't necessarily think about their choices in terms of lanes or even in terms of policy that sticks together, if you could put it down in a column as quote unquote moderate. They don't think about it that way. They're voting based on personality. They're voting based on other factors. And so as we go down the pike and into the calendar and we see what the impact of these endorsements is, let's not be surprised if voters don't just shift en masse from Klobuchar's camp to Biden's, because that's just not necessarily the way that the minds of voters work.
Right. Ali, I got two questions for you. One about Klobuchar, one about Warren. Let's start with Klobuchar. You mentioned that she was still bullish about Super Tuesday over the weekend. Were you surprised that she decided not to hang on through tomorrow? And do you think that Pete Buttigieg's exit yesterday put some extra pressure on her?
Allison, I'm sort of in the anything can happen camp of covering politics. Maybe that stems from my first campaign being covering the Trump campaign, where literally anything could happen and did.
That'll do it, right?
But I really think that when you're considering, that will do it. And when you're considering, though, the stakes of what happened in South Carolina, we really can't understate the pressure that a lot of these other candidates were under to reconsider why they were in this race. So Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, and Michael Bloomberg are all the candidates who you hear strategists strategists and politicos talking about as they should be considering why and if they should stay in this race. Obviously, for Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, potentially for different reasons, they made the decision to get out of it. But at the same time, it's surprising when any campaign drops out so close to a day of big elections. But at the same time, you have to consider that both Klobuchar and Buttigieg are young. Amy Klobuchar joking on the debate stage a few weeks ago that 60 is the new 30. They can run again. They have political futures in this party. And so to drop out early and to not, in her case, potentially have an embarrassing finish in her home state, it could be a face-saving move, but it also lends to the inevitability that's happening right now around Joe Biden as the non-Sanders option for voters.
All right, so you touched on this. You are up in Boston, Massachusetts. That's Elizabeth Warren's home state. A lot of people talking about Super Tuesday now as a two-man race between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. So what does all this mean for Warren?
So Elizabeth Warren's theory of the case has always been that she kind of wanted it to come down to Bernie, Biden, and herself. And that's something that the campaign has even been saying in a new memo that came out yesterday. Their strategy always was to stay in at least through Super Tuesday, though. If you read this memo, they use words like long haul, and they call Milwaukee, the DNC convention, their final play. So what that tells us is that they've always been in the business of trying to earn as many delegates as possible. They feel really good about how they're going to do on Super Tuesday in terms of picking up delegates across the map. The thing that's less assured and the thing that you do not hear them exuding confidence about is what state she's going to come out of with an actual tangible win. And so it's all well and good to say that Milwaukee is your final play. But at the same time, I do sort of have a hard time believing that Elizabeth Warren will be able to walk into the convention and say that she hasn't won any states, but that she should have a right to fight to be the nominee. So that's sort of the Warren campaign battle right now. That being said, for all of these campaigns and candidates, there's a question of a will and a way to stay in. The way forward is to have the strategy of getting into Super Tuesday and knowing what delegates you want to pick up. But at the same time, having the way to do that means having the cash to do it. And so for the Warren campaign, coming off of February with $29 million extra in their pocket, that's why they feel bullish about staying in this race, and that's why they're playing through Super Tuesday. But remember, the key for them always was being the bridge between the so-called moderate lane and the so-called progressive lane. So being the bridge now between Biden and Sanders.
Yeah, money may not buy you the nomination, but it will certainly buy you a little bit more time. Ali Vitali in Boston, Massachusetts, thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.